Okay, good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you from St. Francisville, Louisiana. It's so good to be here today. Thank you very much for joining us. We are in the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is the only book within the Pentateuch which presents first-person narration. We've been talking about authorship. We've been talking about these things for quite some time now, several weeks, several months, and just want you to know that we are going to continue with that into today's class. Now, one of the things that I wanted to state on the beginning of the class on the front end is that just because Deuteronomy employs the first-person narration, that is not unknown from antiquity. We see this in other works which are associated even at times with pseudepigraphy, that is false attribution of a work to a certain personality. In other words, there might be a work which is not really the person who is claimed by the work to be the author of that piece, but still yet, it is unique within Deuteronomy. It in and of itself, the use of first person, is not enough to win the case against claims which people make as far as Mosaic authorship. There is a prejudice in the academic community against the authenticity of, first of all, against the authenticity of the entirety of the Tanakh, and in many camps on the minimalist side. But in terms of Deuteronomy, there is an extreme prejudice where the academic community, for the most part, puts Deuteronomy, all of Deuteronomy, at a much later date. And certainly, I think it would be very minimal numbers within the academic community who would attribute any of the book to Moses. And what I intend to do is challenge that. I intend to put forward over the course of the next several weeks, a couple of months, a different idea altogether. And we're going to look very closely at the switching of persons between first and third. We're going to try to identify within this work called Deuteronomy, called Devarim, an earlier underlying strata of the text, an earlier source, if you will, that was utilized in the writing of Deuteronomy. So I hope that you will stay with me as we work through this. I think that the use of the first person is certainly worth noting, and in particular, the switching back and forth between the first and the third person in the narrative flow. So what I want you to get is that, at least in my understanding, this provides evidence of, as we work through the text, different hands, different authors, different sources within the book of Deuteronomy. And I would suggest and propose that one of those sources could very likely be the actual work that Moses wrote and not another. So in a way, this is an attempt, I think a valiant attempt, by the way, to defend Deuteronomy. As we work through the text, you will see what I'm talking about. In particular, we're going to be looking for evidence of third person versus first person, and that will become obvious as we work through the class. Now, what I want to do is I want you to go with me this morning, first thing, to the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 33, Numbers chapter 33, and I want to read the first two verses. I'm reading from the JPS, not my favorite translation, but where I need to go more literal, I can do that with the Hebrew, which I have at hand. So go with me, Numbers 33, verses 1 and 2. These were the marches of the Israelites who started out from the land of Egypt, troop by troop, in the charge of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded the starting points of their various marches as directed by the Lord. Their marches by starting points were as follows. And then what follows is the list of the movements of the children of Israel. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice is that this is written in the third person. In Numbers chapter 33, the author, the scribe, the writer is informing us that Moses did in fact, at least traditionally, write some sort of travel itinerary. That's what is being reported here. So the writer is reporting a memory or a tradition that one of the things that Moses did write is this travel itinerary. Now, this is an interesting proposal, and I think that it will make more sense the longer we stay with this study. So this reference in Numbers chapter 33, verses 1 and 2, is one of 7 references in the Pentateuch, in the 5 books, which says very plainly that Moses wrote something. And all 7 of these references are in the third person. Now again, it's most natural that a person writing is going to write in the first person. These references, all 7 of them that tell us that Moses wrote something, are in the third person. And in fact, the Hebrew says, Vayiktov Moshe, and Moses wrote. And then it goes on. If you were to follow this through, you would see, notice that it says, verse 2, Moses wrote the starting points of their various marches as directed by the Lord. Their marches. See, it's third person. It's as if the author is outside of the contemporary story, referring to it as a person who wasn't there, but is referring to the events that someone else did at another time. And then as you work through, you'll notice that. Now, we do get the impression that the author wants us to know that these marches are divinely orchestrated. They're led by God's mouth. Literally, these are the marches and their journeys and so forth, according to the mouth of God. And then follows, if you were to follow chapter 33, we're going to quickly go through this. In 33, look at verse 3. They set out from Ramesses in the first month. See that? Third person. Then you go down to verse 5. The Israelites set out from Ramesses. If a person is writing this who's part of that march, who is part of that time and place, it would be more natural for this to read, we set out from Ramesses. We did this. We went here, etc. Now look at verse 6. They set out from Sukkot. Look at verse 7. They set out from Etam and turned toward Pi-Hahirot, which faces Baal-Zephon, and they encamped before Migdal. Verse 8, they set out. Verse 9, they set out from Marah. They, verse 10, they set out from Elim. You notice the point that I want you to get. If you were to read, we're not going to do it this morning, but if you were to read verses 6 through 37 of Numbers 33, you will notice that it is all in the third person. Now, we have a record in Numbers 33, 1 and 2, that Moses wrote a travel itinerary. Is this, the question is this in Numbers 33, that travel itinerary, the recording of the places that they went and left from here, and they, is this it, or did another writer, perhaps, have before him or her, could have been a woman, an actual copy of Moses' travel diary? You know, and that person, the scribe, the later scribe, is looking, and maybe Moses' travel itinerary simply said, for instance, this particular place, from Etam, from here to here to here. And then this person is incorporating that in the story. That's a possibility. We don't know. Now, here's what we do know. Here's what we do know. In the book of Deuteronomy, particularly in the early chapters of that work, there's something interesting. In Deuteronomy, particularly from Horeb forward, remember they leave Mitzrayim, they leave Egypt, and they quickly make their way. Within a very few weeks, they arrive at a place called Horeb. And the travel itinerary, which I'll show you in Deuteronomy, picks up from Horeb. And it goes from Horeb all the way until the children of Israel prepared to go into the land. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about that. We have a memory in Numbers 33 that Moses did in fact write a travel itinerary, but the one contained in the book of Numbers is third person. Guess what? Deuteronomy also has a travel itinerary. And look, it's different than what we read in other books of the Pentateuch, but there's something that really stands out. It should strike us as readers. It is in the first person. In the first person. So whoever wrote this, and let me propose that Moses wrote this because it's in the first person. Now again, just because something is written in the first person, scholars don't accept that evidence weighty enough to sway them to say what I just said. They would say, well, someone is wanting you to feel like you're part of the journey and it is a pseudepigraphical work. It's falsely attributed to Moses. But I find it striking that only in Deuteronomy do we find first person. And it's not the entire book. It switches back and forth. So what I'm telling you from the outset is quite possibly the author, the writer, the scribe, the editor, redactor who put together Deuteronomy as we have it is utilizing source material that could in fact go back to Moses. Now, I want you to go with me to the book of Deuteronomy, and we've covered some of this. Remember, verses 1 through 5 in Deuteronomy clearly are in the third person. These are the words that Moses addressed. See, it's telling us an editor, a redactor, a final writer, a compiler of these stories is giving us very useful information. But he's also telling us, or she, as the case might be, that I'm writing and I'm not Moses. Now look at verse 6. Verse 6 is something very different. The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you've stayed at this mountain long enough. Start out, make your way to the hill country. You see, what it begins to do is it's telling us, first person common plural, we, our God spoke to us. When you read Deuteronomy 1:6, if you're trained to do this, you should be struck by the fact that this writing has a feel of antiquity and authenticity that is, it indicates to the reader that this should say, hey, Moses wrote this. Now it goes all the way through like this. He tells stories from the first person. Many of the stories which are in Deuteronomy, and scholars have always noted this, don't agree with the narrative of, say, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. They have different details. They word things differently. They use different vocabulary. We've covered all this in previous classes. But this is very interesting. Look down at verse 19. Let's follow the trail. We set out from Horeb and traveled the great and terrible wilderness that you saw along the road to the hill country of the Amorites, as the Lord our God had commanded us. When we reached Kadesh Barnea, you see that? And you just work your way through. Verse 20, I said to you, you've come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving to us. See, it welcomes you into the story as it unfolds as a first-person narrative. Look down at chapter 2, verse 1. Thus, after you had remained at Kadesh all that long time, we marched back into the wilderness by the way of the Sea of Reeds, as the Lord had spoken to me. You see that? Now look down at verse 8. We then moved on away from our kinsmen, the descendants of Esau who live in Seir, away from the road of the Arava, away from Elat and Ezion Gever, and we marched on in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. So what I want you to understand is the way I understand the way this is put together in its final form. The writer of Numbers, I do not believe that Moses wrote the book of Numbers as we have it, in the form that we have it, but I do think that Numbers 33, being one of the 7 references to Moses writing something, is telling us somewhere Moses recorded a travel itinerary, and what is striking is that Deuteronomy perhaps contains underneath the text a record of, it's been maybe perhaps the actual travel itinerary that Moses wrote is being incorporated into the book which we now have as Deuteronomy. And it's discernible by the switching to the first person. Okay? Now, but you have to be careful. All of Deuteronomy is not written in this way. In other words, we have other things which come into the text which are helpful things by the scribe, the narrator, the editor, that are put in, helpful information, but it clearly stands apart from the work of Moses. And this is indicated either by the intrusion of third person, like I'm reading a first person text, we did this, the Lord spoke to me. And then there is this intrusion into the text which is written in the third person. Clearly a switch. And so you have to identify those. At other times, we'll see anachronisms. We'll see something that is written obviously at a later time, which is incorporated into a work presenting itself as being contemporary to the time of Moses. So let me give you an example. We touched this last week. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 10 through 12, you'll have in your notes, but just listen to verse 12. Similarly, Seir was formerly inhabited by the Horites, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them, wiping them out and settling in their place, just as Israel did in the land they were to possess, which the Lord had given to them. You see, it's third person. Not only is it third person, this is before, chronologically in the text, Deuteronomy falls before the entry into the land. They have not yet dispossessed anyone from the land of Canaan, which they were promised to the fathers. They've not yet crossed the Jordan. And yet this is helpful information. The writer has told us that Seir was formerly inhabited by the Horites, but Esau dispossessed the Horites, just like Israel dispossessed the inhabitants of the land. You see that? Clearly not written at that time. It's written later. How much later? It has to be at least later than the conquest of Canaan. All right? That's just one of the things we have to look for. Now go down to chapter 3. Deuteronomy chapter 3. And you can do this letter by letter, line by line, word by word, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. I'm not going to do that with you at this point. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. We made our way up the road toward Bashan, and the king Og of Bashan with all his men took the field against us at Edrei. You see, this is clearly the first person. We did this, first person common plural. Chapter 3, verse 2, but the Lord said to me, first person. It's like Moses is writing this. Don't fear him, for I'm delivering him and all his men and his country into your power. You will do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites who lived in Heshbon. Now, verse 3, look at verse 3. The Lord our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan with all his men, and we dealt them such a blow that no survivor was left. You see? Now, in the book of Exodus or Numbers, for instance, you would find, and they, they took Og in Bashan. They did this, they did that. It was their march. They did this. It's all third person. Verse 4, at that time we captured all his towns. There was not a town that we did not take from them. 60 towns, the whole district of the Argov, the kingdom of Og and Bashan. Now, as we work through, though, again, we have to be attentive. We have to pay attention because there are intrusions into the text. And I'm saying intrusion to make the point. They are bits of added information, narrative supporting context that's clearly written by someone who's helping us. Let's say an editor or a redactor. For instance, in verse 8 of chapter 3, we seized at that time from the 2 Amorite kings the country beyond the Jordan. Well, that's kind of interesting because you might expect it to say this land on this side of the Jordan because that's where the speaker, Moses, is coming from. But then when you get down to verse 11, it describes, I mentioned this last week, King Og of Bashan and his giant bed, which is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It's 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit. This indicates that by the time this was written, this was a tourist attraction. You can go to Rabbah of the Ammonites right now, bring the kids, see the giant bed of Og. So that's sort of an indication to me. I would put that as being written at a later time. Now look down at verse 14 for another example. Chapter 3, Deuteronomy, verse 14. Yair, son of Manasseh, received the whole Argov district, that is Bashan, as far as the boundary of the Geshurites and the Maachathites, and named it after himself, Havot Yair, as is still the case. Now, in the Hebrew, it says, Ad Hayom Hazeh, unto this day. So the writer, who's the writer? Don't know. The writer is telling us that this particular area is named after Yair, right? It's called Havot Yair unto this day. Now, a contemporary writer would not say unto this day and get the effect that a later writer would. Let's imagine we're at that time. Moses says, Yair, you can have this land right here. And he says, oh boy, thank you very much. And then right after that, if Moses is writing this, he would say, and it's been his land unto this day. Yair would say, yeah, you just gave it to me. It implies that this is written at a later time, that unto the time of writing, the land that Moses gave to Yair is still, that belongs to Yair. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, this week, the weekly Parsha, the portion of Scripture that we are entering into, is very interesting indeed. It's called Va-Etchannan, and it means I pleaded. And it runs from Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23, all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 11. Va-Etchannan. Now, it arguably contains some of the most important material in all of Scripture. I say arguably. I guess someone could argue against me. I mean, I know they can because I get those emails. But what I mean is, someone could argue that these are not the most important words. But I think they are, because within this portion of Scripture, we have not only the giving of the 10 words, at least one account, one version of the 10 words. We also get the Shema, and we also get the Ahavta, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, etc. 10 words, the Shema, you shall love the Lord your God, all of that and more is contained within this particular Pentateuch portion known as Va-Etchannan. Va-Etchannan. But even in these sections, which contain the most important words in all of Scripture, arguably, we have to be careful. We have to be careful to discern between who is writing and what person. Is it first person? Is it third person? And if we can identify that, we're in a better place to really recognize that which dates back to the time of Moses and can be ascribed to the hand of Moses, if you will. So go with me to chapter 3, verse 21. And we're going to look at some of these. We're going to continue this first person, third person. 3:21, I also charged Joshua at that time, saying, you've seen with your own eyes all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings, so shall the Lord do to all the kingdoms into which you shall cross over. Don't fear them, for it's the Lord your God who will battle for you. It seems like that's written in a contemporary time. I don't see anything that stands out there. Verse 23, and I pleaded with the Lord at that time, Moses first person, saying, O Lord God, you who let your servant see the first works of your greatness and your mighty hand, you whose powerful deeds no God in heaven or on earth can equal, let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, that good hill country in the Lebanon. But the Lord was wrathful with me on your account, would not listen to me. The Lord said to me, enough, never speak to me on this matter again. Go up to the summit of Pisgah, gaze about to the west, north, south, east. Look at it well, for you shall not go across yonder Jordan. Give Joshua his instructions, imbue him with strength and courage, for he shall go across the head of the people. He shall allot to them the land that you may only see. Now, this is written in the first person. Moses is relaying that he requested of God to go into the land. And God tells him, don't say that again. You're not going in. And Moses, according to Moses' first person account here, it's because he's disallowed to enter the land, not for anything he did, but on account of the people, something they did. All right, now that's interesting, and I'm not going to get into that too much, except to say there are 3 references in Deuteronomy, and let's look at those where Moses describes God's anger directed at him because of what they did, the people. Look at chapter 1, verse 37. Because of you, the Lord was incensed with me too. And he said, you shall not enter it either. Joshua, son of Nun, who attends you, he shall enter it. Imbue him with strength, for he shall allot it to Israel. And then, of course, we have the passage, Deuteronomy 3, verse 23 through 28, where Moses is consistent to 137 and 38 and says again that God is angry at him because of the people. And there's one more. Look at chapter 4, verse 21. Now the Lord was angry with me on your account, and swore that I should not cross the Jordan and enter the good land that the Lord your God is assigning you as a heritage. For I must die in this land. I shall not cross the Jordan, but you will cross and take possession of that good land. Now, the reason I bring this up is because Moses is consistent, Deuteronomy, I should say, is consistent in saying that Moses' disallowance to enter the land is not because of anything he did. Now, if you read in the book of Numbers chapter 20, verse 10 through 13, we're not going to do this today, or if you go to Numbers chapter 27, verse 12 through 23, you'll read a different reason that Moses is not allowed to cross into the land. Now, you don't have to come up with the same solution to this discrepancy that I do. You might think, or maybe this is right, that Moses, in writing his own account of these things, towards the end of the 40 years, wants to say, clear his name, if you will, that he's just saying. But I think he's really recording this here in the first person. Now, moving forward, geographically, in chapter 3, verse 29, it says, meanwhile, we stayed on in the valley near Beit Peor. Beit Peor. So it puts us in the plains of Moab, near Beit Peor, where this incident happened, which we talked about back in the book of Numbers. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 4 begins with Moses charging Israel to listen. And listen, various forms of the Hebrew Shema appear over and over in Deuteronomy. It's something like 80 or 90 times. I don't have the direct count, the exact count, but it's very, very frequently, listen, 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 Shema, Shema, Shema. And so, but he wants them to understand, listen, pay heed to what is following, and then he adds a warning against adding to or taking from the word which he is commanding you, plural. So if you look at verse 2, you shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you. So Moses is affixing to his law, if you will, his Torah, a warning against adding to or taking away. And then he underscores that by saying that in this way you'll guard the commandments. Look where it says, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you. Here in the Hebrew, where the English says keep in the JPS and other translations, the Hebrew is shmar, means to guard. So just so you understand, to guard Moses' instruction, guarding means don't let anything in, don't let anything out. Preserve it, keep it, guard it. That's what he told them. Now, then begins the lead up in our narrative to the account of the giving of the 10 words. Look at verse 9 of chapter 4, Deuteronomy 4, beginning in verse 9. But take utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously, so that you don't forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and to your children's children, the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, notice first person, gather the people to me that I may let them hear my words, in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on the earth, and may so teach their children. You came forward and stood at the foot of the mountain. The mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark with densest clouds. The Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a voice. He declared to you the covenant that he commanded you to do, the 10 commandments, and he inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone. You saw nothing, Moses clearly communicates. No form, just a voice. Now, Deuteronomy is very consistent on this. We've talked in previous classes. Exodus and Numbers are a little bit different. Think of texts like Exodus 24, where it says they saw the God of Israel, the elders, but here in Deuteronomy, it's very consistent. You didn't see anything. You didn't see a form, don't make a form, right? You only heard a voice, the words. And it says that's it. That's your only experience. The question becomes, what did they hear? What was it that was heard on the day of assembly from the midst of the fire, the foundation of everything in the text? Words spoken by God to an entire nation assembled at Horeb, at Sinai. What was that which was spoken? And here it says, He told to you, plural, He told y'all, His covenant, which He commanded you to do. It's more of a literal translation of verse 13. And then it doesn't say the 10 Commandments in the Hebrew. I know you probably all know this, but it says Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words, the 10 sayings, the 10 things, if you will. He told you 10 things, 10 words, 10 sayings, and He wrote them on 2 stone tablets. Now, verse 15 picks up again, For your own sake, therefore, be most careful. You saw no shape when the Lord your God spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. So Deuteronomy is very emphatic. You didn't see anything, you only heard it, and it also is it's almost like this is bold in the text. God spoke to you from the midst of the fire. All right. Now, the covenant, according to Deuteronomy 4 that we just read, the covenant was spoken by God, and it's called Aseret HaDevarim in Deuteronomy, the 10 words. Now, in Exodus 20, the other account of these 10 words, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say in Exodus 20, God spoke these 10 words. Deuteronomy teaches us that. And another text in Deuteronomy, and another text in Exodus that we're going to get to later. Not this week. Next week. Next week is going to be exciting. I can't wait to get to next week, but we have plenty to cover today. But they're called in the English translation here the 10 Commandments. Most people know them, what God spoke is the 10 Commandments. But again, Aseret HaDevarim according to Deuteronomy. In fact, the English, the 10 Commandments, is derived from 3 verses in the Bible, 2 of which we're going to cover next week, but you can go ahead and take them in your notes. Exodus 34:28, that is not in reference to the words that we're talking about today. Let's call it the first set, but I don't want to get into that yet. Exodus 34:28, here in Deuteronomy 4:13, and then in Deuteronomy 10, verse 4. We're going to look at Deuteronomy 10:4 and Exodus 34:28 next week. All right, but they're 10 words. Now, the Greek, I like the way the Greek does it because the Greek really represents what you read in Hebrew by coming up with this phrase, deca and logoi, which is the 10 sayings, the Decalogue. The Decalogue, and that's a good representative for what we read in the Hebrew, Aseret HaDevarim. The 10 words, the 10 sayings. Now these 10 words, they're spoken by God, they're written by God on 2 stone tablets. The question becomes, what did God say? What did God write? What are the precise words of the covenant? Now we're going to continue our study. Go down to verse 40 of chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 40. Observe His laws and commandments which I enjoin upon you this day, that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may long remain in the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you for all time. Moses speaking. Now, look at verse 41. Then Moses set aside 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan to which a manslayer could escape. Then Moses set aside. Notice the switch to third person. to which a manslayer could escape, one who unwittingly slew a fellow man without having been hostile to him in the past. He could flee to one of those cities and live. Bezer in the wilderness in the tableland, belonging to the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead, belonging to the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan, belonging to the Manassites. Now, third person. Is this written by Moses, or is it helpful information by a later scribe? Look at the next verse. This is the teaching that Moses set before the Israelites. Third person. These are the decrees, laws, and rules that Moses addressed to the people of Israel after they had left Egypt, beyond the Jordan. See, again, now we know this is another writer, and not only do we know it's another writer than Moses, we know that it's a writer who is saying and writing this from the land of Canaan, on the other side of the Jordan. All right, so he's telling us about Moses addressing the people beyond the Jordan in the valley at Beit Peor, in the land of King Sihon and the Amorites who dwelt in Heshbon, whom Moses, third person, and the Israelites defeated after they had left Egypt. They had taken possession of his country and that of Og, King Og of Bashan, the two kings of the Amorites, which were on the east side of the Jordan. From Aroer on the banks of the Wadi Arnon, as far as Mount Sion, that is Hermon, also the whole Arava on the east side of the Jordan, as far as the sea of the Arava, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah, Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them. All of that is third person. Now, all of that is third person. Interestingly, the next thing we read switches back. So if you pick it up, Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, now we get the words of Moses. Now the question becomes, is chapter 4, verse 41 through 5:1a of Deuteronomy, is that supplemental material, helpful material, added by a scribe who's incorporating a work of Moses into his or her work? Is that what's going on here? Because listen to this. Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day. Study them, observe them faithfully. You see how it switches? The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb, not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. Face to face, the Lord spoke to you in the mountain out of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain, saying. And now, within this account, we have to assume that now Moses is quoting that which was spoken by God from the mountain on the day of assembly from the midst of the fire. Right? I mean, naturally. Now, notice it begins with God speaking in the first person. I, the Lord, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods beside me. Notice, first person, I'm the Lord. I, you, me. Verse 8, you shall not make for yourself a sculpted image, any likeness of what is in the heaven above or on the earth below or in the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Jehovah, I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, all of that's first person in the English. And in the Hebrew, it's all in first person, except the last word, where it says, keep my commandments. The Hebrew there actually switches to the third. So it really says, showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep his commandments. Interesting what's going on there. But it doesn't stop there. Notice, I want you to understand that keep my commandments, if your English says that, the Hebrew actually says keep his commandments, and it started in God speaking first person. So what does that mean? What does that tell us? Now, verse 11, there, after this reference to keep his commandments, which is third person, the third person continues. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. See, before he was speaking in the first person, he said, I, the Lord. Here it just says, for the Lord will not clear one who swears by his name. It would be more natural, and in the first person it would say, will not swear falsely by my name. Notice the next verse. Observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Not I. See? 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. All of this we work down. Look at verse 15. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, and therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God has commanded you. Go down in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you. All that's verse 16. Now, in verse 19, it says, the Lord spoke those words, those and no more. Now, whatever the words were that were spoken, we get the indication from the writer here that God spoke only the 10 words, and he spoke only the 10 words and then added nothing else. That was the encounter that the children of Israel had at Horeb on the day of assembly from the midst of the fire. Now, the points that I want to bring up, we have two versions of this encounter. One is in Exodus chapter 20. The other is here in Deuteronomy 5. And both of these accounts claim to be that which was what God spoke from Horeb on the day of assembly. Now, what I want you to do, even if you do it at a later point, if you do this for the rest of your Sabbath, some of you were part of our study earlier, but if you'll download, I have 2 documents on my academia page. Now, I don't know if, let me see if I can go ahead and paste this. Those who normally type the notes for me all are occupied today, and so I'm going to paste this in. This is the document that I want you to look at. It's on my academia page, and I'm putting it in Facebook now. And let me put it in YouTube now for those of you who are on YouTube. Let's see if I can do this. Put that in there and one other place. And that way you can follow along and study this over the course. It might take you a week to study, I don't know. But the document, I have 2 versions. I have an English version called A Comparison of the 10 Words in English. And it's just a chart where I take the 10 words, the version of the 10 words according to Exodus 20, and I put them next to the words of the 10 words version that's communicated to us in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And you can look at these as you work through, and you can see that they're not exactly the same. There are differences. The question becomes, what was it? Now, if these are the most important words that God spoke from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly from Horeb, and then he wrote these on 2 stone tablets, you would want to know what these words were. Now, some of you might be saying, well, they're not that different. How different should they be? These are the 10 words. Now, The two versions side by side. Now, if you're a Hebrew reader, you can also get from my academia page the 10 words in Hebrew, a comparison of Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. There are different number of words. In other words, if you look at the text in Hebrew, the text in Exodus, and the text in Deuteronomy, they don't even have the same number of words, and they use different words, different vocabulary words. So we're left with a question as what was that original text? And I'll just hit a few high points. If you look at Exodus 20, again, in Exodus 20, it says in verse 6, doing loving kindness to thousands for one's loving me and for one's guarding or keeping my commandments. There, it stays in the first person. Deuteronomy 5 says, as I just pointed out, guarding his commands. It's a difference there. Deuteronomy switches to the third person earlier than Exodus, but both of them switch to the third person. Now, if you look at the Sabbath command in Exodus says, remember the Sabbath day, to separate it, to sanctify it, to make it holy. Deuteronomy 5 says to guard the Sabbath day, to separate it, and then it adds the clause, or it includes the clause, as which Jehovah your God commanded you. And as you work through, you'll notice that the Sabbath commandment in Exodus, the reason for the Sabbath commandment, as it's recorded in Exodus, is associated with the creation. Because in 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and he rested on the Sabbath day. But if you look at Deuteronomy's version, and these are the words that, according to both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, are words spoken by God. The Deuteronomy's reason is because in order that your servant and your handmaid may rest as you shall remember you were a servant in the land of Egypt. Jehovah your God brought you out from there with a strong hand, stretched out arm, and it again has the clause that your God commanded you to do. Now, as you work through, and the thing that I did in these charts, both the Hebrew chart and the English chart, is I put differences in red, so they really stand out. So you have to ask yourself, was this actually spoken? And why is it different in these two versions? And of the two accounts, what was actually recorded on the stone? Now, when you get towards the covet command, it even employs different Hebrew words. I translate covet and desire because we have different Hebrew words. Now, to some people, they might think, well, what's the big deal? Who cares? Well, I care because I'm trying to figure out what were the words of the covenant. It's so important. Is it, how do we know? I mean, this is important as we work through this. Now, both Exodus and Deuteronomy claim to be reporting the words, and they both claim to be providing us with an accurate account of the words that were spoken and ultimately were written on stone. But these versions differ in detail, so we have to ask ourselves, do we even know what the words that were spoken and written on the tablets were? Both begin in the first person and switch to the third. Neither version is ever quoted in full ever again in Scripture. Now, we do get references which could be pointing towards them in the prophets. You know, you might call them Decalogue intertext or something like that, where a prophet is making a reference. But even there, sometimes the order of these is not the same. If you look at Philo, if you look at the Septuagint, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you look at all the accounts which purport to bring forward the account of the words of the covenant which were spoken by God and ultimately written on the stone, they don't always agree. And in the New Testament, when the New Testament quotes, it doesn't always list it the way that Exodus or Deuteronomy. And some of you might say, well, I don't care what the New Testament says. Well, you ought to in this case, because sometimes the New Testament order agrees with ancient documents like at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the bottom line is we have to ask ourselves, what was spoken from the mountain, out of the midst of fire, on the day of assembly, and ultimately written on the stones? You know why it's a problem? We don't have the stones. And the two versions that we have in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 are different. Maybe subtly, Now, what some of the sages said, well, God spoke them the differences all simultaneously. Well, that's an apologetic approach to the text, which I'm not allowing myself to do. I think that there were 10 matters that were spoken, just as the text says, and where we have differences, we have to find other solutions to those problems. It's easy, and it's a popular thing to do to just cover our face and not address the difficulties. But that's not what I want to do. I want to address the difficulties. I want to search the text. Now, even the 2 stone tablets, which we don't have, I'd love to find them. I think you would as well. But they are only mentioned outside of the Pentateuch, one time. It's actually in 2 texts, but it's the same story. And let me give you the context. What's going on when they're the only other mention to the 10 words on 2 stone tablets directly is when Solomon is dedicating the temple. And one of these is in 1 Kings 8, verse 9. And the other, same narrative, but it's also dealing with Solomon dedicating the temple. It's in 2 Chronicles 5:10. 1 Kings 8:9, 2 Chronicles 5:9 say roughly this. There was nothing inside the box, the chest, the ark, but the 2 tablets of stone which Moses placed there at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after their departure from the land of Egypt. Now, both of these, 1 Kings 8:9, 2 Chronicles 5:10, tell us that there was an ark still there in the time when Solomon dedicated the temple, and that in that box, the only thing that was in that box, despite what you might read by other authors, sages, and even in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews puts all kind of stuff in there. But it's only this, at least as far as the biblical writers go. The question becomes, do either of these represent the precise words of the covenant? Or do neither of these represent the precise words of the covenant? How could something so important not be exact? What are the 10 words? How are they counted? Major religions, Jewish, Christian. By the way, if you look at Judaism is not, even the sources within Judaism are not totally settled on where do you break, this is word 1, this is word 2. The handy little Roman numerals that are on your plaque in your kitchen weren't on the 10 tablets as far as we know. And they're certainly not in the text. The text in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 don't offer us any help as to how to count them. So what's word number 1? What's word number 2? What's word number 10? Some groups break 10 into 2 commandments. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. That's 1. And then don't covet your neighbor's house and all the other stuff. That's 2. And some might say, well, there's no reason for that. That's the reason that it's done is because there's confusion over where to break it. And, by the way, I might add that because the Hebrew uses different words there for coveting of wife and desiring or coveting his things, it's not so off to split it in the middle. That's not what I do. But anyway, just so you know. But if you count them, How do you get to 10? Deuteronomy 4:13, Exodus 34:28, and Deuteronomy 10 verse 4 are very clear that there are 10 words. If you just went to read them, don't look at the plaque in your kitchen. Just open up to Exodus 20, read it, try to find 1 through 10 without, off your memory where you currently divide them. Look and see, can you tell where they break? Do the same in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Major religions disagree on this. What exactly was written on the stone tablets? A lot of people say that the first 5 are written on one tablet and the second 5 are written on another, assuming you know where to break 1 through 5 and so forth. But is that true? Nowhere in the text does it say that 5 were written on one and 5 were written on another. Some people will say that 5 of them deal with your relationship with God and 5 of them deal with your relation to your other humans. It doesn't say that in the text. It just says there are 10 things, and they're written on 2 stone tablets, and the 2 accounts that we have don't agree. Only Moses knows what was written on that first set. Think about it. The words that were spoken by God from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly, written on tablets of stone, preserved in the 2 texts that we have, differ, but the ones that Moses got on Horeb initially, he saw them. No one else saw them whole because they were shattered. They were destroyed. How can we move forward from this place? How will we ever put the pieces of this mystery together again? Man, for that, you have to join me next week. Same time, same channel. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Go read those documents. You figure out what was spoken. We'll talk about it more next week. God bless you.